It's time to take you to school, where today we have interesting facts from an amazing woman known in history for standing up for civil rights and also being the wife of an iconic civil rights leader.
You said it. It is definitely time to share interesting facts from history. And like Frankie said, we are talking about the biography of Betty Shabazz.
That's right, big sis. Looking back at history and the biography of Betty Shabazz, it is a story about a woman who stood up for civil rights and was also married to one of the most iconic men during the civil rights movement named Malcolm X.
Betty Shabazz was such a strong and empowered woman. I can honestly say she is definitely one of my favorite women in history for standing strong during an awful time in history for her husband and her family.
She sure was, big sis. Now, beginning with the first fact from the biography of Betty Shabazz, Betty was actually born Betty Dean Sanders on May 28th, 1934 in Detroit, Michigan.
She was a girl from the Great Lakes.
The Great Lakes? What is that?
That is another lesson for another day, little bro. But talking about Betty's upbringing, at the age of 11, she began living with a local businessman and his wife. Betty was exposed to speaking up against unfair treatment and discrimination at an early age.
How was that, big sis?
Helen Malloy not only helped to raise Betty, but she was also a part of organizing boycotts on stores that discriminated against African Americans. This gave Betty a glimpse into not only what discrimination was in the United States, but how to stand up against those who chose to do evil, like judging people based on the color of their skin.
Wow, so she knew what being an activist looked like at an early age.
She sure did. And she would experience a lot of racism firsthand when heading off for higher education. After finishing high school, Betty studied at a famous institute in Black history called the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It was there that Betty would have to navigate living in Alabama with extreme racism and Jim Crow laws that were frustrating.
You are right, and Betty would later move to the state of New York, where she studied at Brooklyn State College's School of Nursing in New York City. That is where she would be on a path to meeting her person and changing history.
Yes! And that's when a love story and Betty's faith would change. Betty was invited by a nurse's aide to a dinner party at the Nation of Islam temple in Harlem. During her next visit to the temple, Sanders met Malcolm X, and she was inspired.
Yes, Betty began attending Malcolm X's services and would join the Nation of Islam, changing her last name to X to represent the loss of her African heritage.
Who knew traveling to the state of New York would not only change Betty's life, but also the civil rights movement and her support of a civil rights icon as we know it. Betty and Malcolm X got married on January 14th in 1958 in Michigan. The couple eventually had 6 daughters.
Betty's strength and support for her husband and family were out of this world. As Malcolm traveled the United States and the globe, Betty would hold down her family, sacrificing her own dreams to help her husband Malcolm during the civil rights movement.
I told you that he was awesome. But there would be challenges with Betty, Malcolm, and the Nation of Islam. After a disagreement with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm would eventually leave the organization. That is where in 1964, Malcolm X and Betty X would change their last names to Shabazz.
Sadly, the next year on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated while giving a speech at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. Shabazz was in the audience near the stage with her daughters.
That was one of the saddest days in history. Thinking about how Betty felt watching her husband fight to change the world, only to be assassinated for his efforts.
I know, big sis, but Betty would remain strong and went on to raise her 6 daughters alone, helped by annual royalties from her husband's book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, and other publications.
Talking even more about her education, Shabazz completed an undergraduate degree at Jersey City State College, followed by a doctoral degree in higher education administration at the University of Massachusetts. She would go on to accept a position as an associate professor of health sciences at New York's Medgar Evers College.
As I said, Betty Shabazz's story is a story of never giving up for sure.
You are right, little bro. Now, another sad fact from her biography is about her death. Betty had a grandson named Malcolm who was sent to stay with Betty. On June 1st, 1997, Malcolm set a fire in Shabazz's apartment. Shabazz suffered severe burns and died on June 23rd, 1997.
But even though Betty left us on that day, her legacy and story will never be forgotten. So I hope you enjoyed interesting facts from the biography of Betty Shabazz.